Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today I'm checking out one of the cheapest monitors you can get with the potential for true HDR performance, the AOC Q27G3XMN. This is a product from the latest wave of lower cost gaming LCDs that are targeting HDR properly for the first time, which is great news for buyers that wanted this functionality but didn't want to spend upwards of $800 US to access it. The Q27G3XMN is a 27-inch 1440p VA LCD with a refresh rate that tops out at 180Hz, a pretty typical mid-range to budget gaming panel, nothing we haven't seen before. But the crucial feature here is that instead of offering edge-lit dimming or no dimming at all and marketing it as an HDR monitor, this AOC display actually features 336 full-array local dimming zones, which should allow for much tighter dimming and a better real-world contrast ratio than the garbage that usually comes in this tier. Now, 336 zones isn't a huge number, but as far as budget panels are concerned, this is a massive upgrade to what was offered previously. All of this is available right now for as low as $280 US, which is pretty hard to believe given that you can find products of a similar size, resolution, and refresh rate without local dimming at all for about the same price. AOC are pushing the envelope here with this product. That's a really attractive price if it can perform up to scratch, though unfortunately availability is a bit limited. I had to import one of these monitors from the US to test it, as AOC aren't offering it in Australia, at least for now, which seems like a mistake based on its capabilities. Anyway, the design is very much something you would see from other budget LCDs. There's not a lot going on here, and it's not especially premium in its finish. Most outer surfaces are a very basic plastic, the stand legs are grey plastic, the back of the monitor black plastic, and there's a few red highlights. No RGB LED lighting to inflate the price, not too much gamer style nonsense. It's functional but does look a bit cheap. I was also surprised at how thick the display unit is. It's a bit of a chunky product, though personally that's not something I care too much about. The included stand has quite a bit of ergonomic adjustability, including height, tilt, swivel, and pivot adjustment. The base has 4 legs that sit flat on the desk, and while it is wide, each leg is thin so it doesn't take up heaps of desk space. However, it's not the most sturdy stand. There's some wobble when accidentally touching the monitor, and the build quality of the stand pillar is not great. In keeping with other areas of the design, the port selection is very basic, just 2 HDMI 2.0 ports and 1 DisplayPort 1.4 with no USB ports or other connectivity. The lack of USB is a little concerning, as that almost certainly prevents user firmware updates. The use of HDMI 2.0 also means the monitor is restricted to 144Hz over HDMI instead of the full 180Hz, so ideally HDMI 2.1 should have been used. But the DP 1.4 port is fine for the full 180Hz functionality on PC. The screen coating is typical of most VA LCDs in that it uses a matte anti-glare coating, which is good at reducing reflections in a bright environment, though it does naturally diffuse ambient light. I describe the matte coating as light to medium. The on-screen display is difficult to navigate because AOC does not provide a directional toggle to access it, rather we are getting basic face buttons along the bottom right edge. The interface does include typical color controls as well as gamer features like an FPS counter and shadow boosting, though it's not especially feature-rich. With that said, I was pleased to find graceful switching between the SDR and HDR modes that preserve key settings and requires no user interaction once each mode is configured how you like. For motion performance, AOC offers 4 overdrive settings, the first of which is off, which gives us a look at native panel performance. This isn't an especially fast display when configured like this, but actually doesn't perform as badly as some VA LCDs that I've seen with overdrive enabled, so it's a somewhat acceptable start. The weak mode doesn't improve performance substantially, and we continue to see a greater grey average above 10 milliseconds. However, there is no overshoot and cumulative deviation has improved slightly. When we get to the medium mode, performance is better, now producing a 9 millisecond average and a small amount of overshoot. However, cumulative deviation has improved to 610, which isn't too bad, and while there is some dark smearing, it's on the milder side in terms of response times and cumulative deviation. Still, I wouldn't describe this mode as especially fast relative to other modern LCD panels. The strong mode at 180Hz is clearer and produces less dark smearing than the medium mode, but this does come at the cost of overshoot. The average response is significantly better at 4.64 milliseconds, and cumulative deviation is superior as well at 538, but at times you will see some overshoot as the trade-off. Having looked at both the medium and strong modes in games, I would prefer to use the strong mode at the highest refresh rate. It is clearer in my opinion. I think part of this is the big improvement to dark smearing to the point where it's almost but not quite a non-issue. Unfortunately, the strong mode is not especially suitable for variable refresh rate gamers. The level of inverse ghosting increases at lower refresh rates, and by the time you get to around 120 to 100 Hz, this artifact is definitely noticeable. I'd completely rule it out for 60 Hz gaming. The alternate choice for variable refresh is the medium mode, which is slower and has more dark smearing, but has acceptable overshoot across the entire refresh range. You're getting an 8.5 millisecond experience most of the time, and inverse ghosting artifacts are negligible even at 60 Hz. What you do miss out on though is that faster, clearer experience at 180 Hz. So unfortunately, the Q27G3XMN does not have a single overdrive mode experience. Gamers mostly playing at higher refresh rates should choose the strong mode, while those playing at lower refresh rates should choose medium. If you're playing a variety of games, I'd probably stick to medium, although it's not especially fast. This display would have benefited from variable overdrive to keep performance in check at all refresh rates, or a mode that split the difference between strong and medium. Compared to other monitors at their max refresh rate, this budget AOC is competitive on response speed with other LCDs, but achieves this with a much higher level of overshoot. So for example, you do get similar transition times to the Gigabyte M27QP, but the Gigabyte achieves this with around half the inverse ghosting rate. In this mode, the AOC is really pushed to the limits, so we'll need more data before seeing if this is a success. When looking at average performance across the refresh range, I've chosen the overdrive setting that is best for variable refresh, which is medium. Here the AOC model is a lot less impressive, though it's not a disastrous result up against affordable IPS LCDs like the M27QP and G274QPF-QD. The Q27G3XMN does have more overshoot, but it's a negligible amount more. Meanwhile, the XV275UP3 is faster with a lot more overshoot, and the 273CQRX-QD is a bit faster with a bit more overshoot. On average, using the medium mode, the AOC model does have some dark smearing, but it's not a terrible result like the GP2711 from Cooler Master. Given the strong mode at 180 Hz can nearly eliminate the issue, I'd say this is a better than average result from a VA panel, but it's not fully resolved, especially for gamers that target lower refresh rates. Combining all these factors, we have cumulative deviation that looks at the balance between speed and overshoot. The Q27G3XMN is one of the better performing VA LCDs, especially outside of Samsung monitors. It performs better than the XV275UP3 and much better than the GP2711. In fact, looking at all the VA monitors I've tested in this metric, the AOC model is the best from a non-Samsung brand, and that allows it to perform around the mark of entry-level or last-generation IPS panels. For example, it's not that different to the M27QP on average. The types of artifacts you get differ, but it's not out of place. It actually outperforms the Pixio PX277 Prime that uses last-gen IPS prior to the shift to nano IPS and fast IPS type panels. With that said, it's not an overly fast product. The LG 27GP83B that also competes in the value-oriented 1440p monitor space produced a 24% better result, so it's not as clear as those types of LCDs. But I know some gaming monitor buyers get very nervous about the performance of a VA LCD as the tech isn't known for speed, and honestly I don't think this result is that bad. It's definitely a step better than what we were getting say 3 or 4 years ago. For fixed 120Hz gaming, performance isn't amazing but acceptable considering the results from other mid to lower price displays. At 60Hz, this VA is very similar to a lot of other LCDs and ends up delivering a mid-table result, which is quite decent for those expecting to play in the lower refresh range. While the Q27G3XMN does not have a backlight strobing mode, I thought it would still be worth it to compare to other monitors so you can see how the balance of speed and dark smearing and overshoot plays out. As you can see, there are some dark trails, but it's not as severe as typical VA examples, and yeah, like I said, it's not overly fast, but still acceptable in a lot of gaming scenarios. Input latency is fine with an SDR processing delay of 1.3 milliseconds. This monitor isn't really designed for latency-sensitive competitive gaming, but still offers good speed for those that want to utilize its 180Hz capabilities. Power consumption is average at 37 watts for a full white 200 nit screen. This is around 10 watts higher than the Acer XV275UP3 and Cooler Master GP2711 that also use VA LCDs with full array local dimming. So the AOC model is a bit less efficient in its backlight design. but it's also not consuming stupidly high amounts for a 27-inch monitor. Looking now at color performance, and the Q27G3XMN is a wide gamut monitor that covers 96% of the DCI-P3 color space, so that's a result that's pretty typical of today's gaming monitors. We end up with 75% Rec 2020 coverage, decent though behind the top panels that use quantum dots to enhance the LCD gamut. Certainly that color performance is good enough for HDR. From the factory, this monitor ships with quite good grayscale calibration, gamma performance is excellent, and the color temperature is only slightly tinted warm relative to what is accurate. This keeps delta E's low for a gaming display. However, like a lot of wide gamut monitors, oversaturation is present for SDR content by default, which typically expects the Rec 709 color space. Compared to other displays, grayscale performance is very good by default, and color checker performance, while not especially accurate, is also strong compared to the competition. AOC do offer an sRGB mode, though unfortunately it locks you out of many settings, like white balance controls. Nevertheless, it does a decent job preserving the great grayscale performance we saw from earlier, while introducing a gamut clamp that emulates the sRGB color space and prevents oversaturation. We end up getting delta E averages below 4.0 in saturation and color checker, which is a very strong result, and shows a good level of factory tuning in this configuration. Compared to other monitors, sRGB mode grayscale performance is quite good, as is the case for color checker. This means the Q27G3XMN is well calibrated from the factory, generally speaking, and it's quite easy to operate in a way that looks good. Of course, performance can be improved through a full calibration, and in general, I'd say it's quite easy to calibrate. The end results are great, especially for sRGB content, while for DCI-P3 it's pretty good except for the very edges of the color space, as we don't get full coverage. Peak SDR brightness is great at 521 nits, that's more than enough for most usage environments and far ahead of even the highest end OLED panels. Minimum brightness of 63 nits is okay, though not especially dim for nighttime usage. What was interesting to discover is that the Q27G3XMN's native contrast ratio is 4,438 to 1, which is great even among VA panels. It's not quite at the level of the Acer XV275UP3, but pretty close, delivering good black performance even with local dimming disabled, which is the case in the SDR mode by default. This is a much higher ratio than IPS LCDs, allowing it to deliver deeper native blacks, and it sets a good foundation for local dimming. Viewing angles from this panel are not amazing, certainly quite a bit worse than standard IPS LCDs, though not nearly as dreadful as TN LCDs. The main issue with this VA LCD is gamma shifting at off angles, so if you're not viewing it dead on directly in front, you'll see the panel wash out a bit and the backlight becomes more visible, reducing the contrast ratio. This is especially noticeable while local dimming is enabled. The panel looks great when viewing at no angle with deep blacks, but even at a small angle off center, the zone barriers become much more visible and blooming is accentuated. This is likely to happen even with something as simple as not having the monitor high enough and not tilting it to point at your eyes. I don't think this is a deal breaker, but it's essential to have the monitor set up and correctly angled to get the best experience. For uniformity, I'd describe this panel as mediocre. My unit had a noticeable vignette around the edges, likely an artifact of how the multi-zone backlight is configured. There was also a slight color tone shift from the left to right of the panel, the left side being slightly cooler. It's not an unusable result, but for color accurate work like in Photoshop or something, I'd ideally have liked a much more even experience. For gaming, this shouldn't be much of an issue. When it comes to HDR performance, the Q27G3XMN is decently well equipped with a 336 zone full array local dimming backlight. This is a lower backlight zone count than other LCDs I've recently been tested, which typically start at 576 zones and can exceed 1,000 zones for high-end models. It's even fewer zones than the Acer XV275UP3 I recently reviewed, which had 384. However, with the right dimming algorithm, and in this case a high native VA contrast ratio, 336 zones can actually be sufficient for a good HDR experience. This amount of zones is a significant upgrade over edge-lit dimming, as the zones are much smaller and more effective. I've shown in previous videos how crappy edge-lit panels are, but basically, if there's a bright object in the center of the display surrounded by black or near black, an edge-lit panel will illuminate an entire section of the display that stretches from top to bottom just to show that central object at the correct brightness. This causes notably raised blacks in conditions where they shouldn't be raised, and most of the time, all of the dimming zones on an edge-lit panel will be active. With 336 full array zones, the panel can more tightly dim around objects in the center of the display, and you won't see elevated brightness extending from those objects all the way to the edges of the screen. This results in a far superior HDR experience that really can deliver the high contrast ratio that's required. Bright and dark objects can be reasonably close together, with the bright object shining at over 1,000 nits of brightness, while the nearby dark area is rich in shadow detail and blacks. A VA LCD with just 336 zones doesn't have the same level of control as an OLED with per pixel local dimming, or the best 1,000 plus zone LCDs. But 336 zones with a VA panel is sufficient for a lot of HDR scenes and ends up delivering a good entry to mid-level HDR experience. The main limitations are when bright and dark areas need to be relatively close together. The dimming system here can't always get tight enough as each zone deals with roughly 10,000 pixels. This can lead to blooming around some small objects, and it's especially noticeable in scenes with large uniform areas and high contrast edges. You'll see blooming around a bright white mouse icon on a dark grey background. Sharp edges in a UI can cause some vignetting and almost a gradient-like effect as the backlight tries to manage its illumination level because it can't dim exactly along the edge. Starfields, Christmas lights, subtitles can all lead to blooming artifacts that you wouldn't see on either a higher zone count LCD or an OLED. Nevertheless, this type of panel can still enhance both brightness and contrast over a typical SDR experience, and you will much more often get a higher than SDR contrast compared to an edge-lit panel. It's a good experience in most games and a fantastic entry point to HDR if you haven't owned an HDR display before. This monitor comes with a few different HDR settings, though I found the default to be the best, which is the display HDR mode with local dimming set to strong. Adjusting the HDR mode makes little difference, while turning down the local dimming setting raises the black level. For the best, deepest blacks, you'll want to keep it on strong. EOTF tracking is average. You'll see that the grey result line tracks a little below the yellow expected line for most of the curve, which indicates the display is a little too dim relative to accurate across most of the range. Roll-off is good around max brightness. However, dark tracking is again a little too dim, not to the point where you can't see anything, but a little short of accurate. Color accuracy in the HDR mode is fine, although gamut luminance is low, so highly saturated colors aren't as bright as they should be. On the brightness front, the Q27G3XMN is excellent, producing nearly 1400 nits full screen sustained, very high even for an LCD. This is obviously far superior to OLED displays and most other HDR monitors for that matter. 10% brightness is good at 1245 nits, though this is more a result that matches other LCDs. Then for 2% brightness, the AOC model delivers just shy of 1000 nits, which is still a great result, but with OLEDs able to also produce great brightness here, it doesn't have a significant advantage. Still, for a $280 monitor, this is fantastic. When looking at brightness versus window size for some similar LCDs, as well as the PG27AQDM OLED, you'll see that all of the LCD options are much brighter for content with an APL of 10% or greater relative to the OLED. The two VA options, the AOC and Acer, are leading the pack here with especially strong results, though the Acer is generally brighter. At lower APL, below 10%, it's a much of a muchness really. Most are in that 1000 nit zone, which delivers good highlight brightness. Real-world brightness is good, though it does depend on the scene. In a high APL scene like this, the AOC model delivers over 1000 nits real-world, which is a strong result. However, in scene 2, which measures a smaller element, I only saw 631 nits of brightness. There is quite a variance between products as to which shows the highest brightness here. Then for gaming, I typically saw anywhere from 750 to 1000 nits real-world, with the absolute brightest scenes pushing up to 1300 nits. As for best case contrast, the AOC model is pretty strong, delivering around a 380,000 to 1 ratio. This is much higher than IPS LCDs with similar amounts of local dimming, and it absolutely destroys edge-lit options. For local contrast, with a bright and dark element close together, I achieved a contrast ratio of 8,170 to 1, which is about double the panel's native contrast ratio, a decent though not outstanding result from its 336 zone local dimming. It was interesting to see this panel match the GP2711, which has a higher 576 zone count, but the XV275UP3 was notably better despite having 384 zones, much closer to what the AOC has. Still, 336 zones with a VA panel has better dimming ability than 576 zones with an IPS panel. In fact, it's not really close. VA is much better suited technology to HDR, at least with these types of zone counts. Then for checkerboard contrast, again, we're getting a good result of about 8,800 to 1. That's about half the contrast of the Neo G7, which has nearly 4 times the zones, a result that makes perfect sense when you consider how zone count affects area. Lastly, HDR input lag is quite high with a processing delay of 17.5 milliseconds when run in the HDR mode with local dimming enabled. While this isn't unusual for an LCD with local dimming, it is much more lag than the SDR mode without dimming. It's around 3 frames of latency at 180Hz, an issue you don't see with OLED monitors, and about 1 additional frame of latency relative to the XV275UP3. Final section of this review is the new Hub Essentials Checklist 2.0. In this first part, we're looking at how AOC advertises the monitor and whether this is accurate. For the most part, AOC does a good job of providing accurate or conservative specifications, aside from response times, which like a lot of monitors are misleading with that 1 millisecond figure. That said, it's good to see a product in this price class that claims HDR performance that actually delivers with good local dimming instead of giving us the garbage that is edge-lit dimming. The second part of the checklist looks at feature support and performance standards across many key areas. There's a couple of important aspects to go over. Dark smearing gets a borderline result because you can largely minimize this at 180Hz, but can't do so across the entire refresh range without introducing other issues. Input lag is also around the 1 millisecond mark for SDR. I also gave a borderline result for good EOTF tracking because the result isn't terrible, but it's also not amazing, though generally I think it's acceptable for HDR gaming. No backlight strobing leads to quite a few red crosses. The other notable aspects are the limited port selection, which means we don't get user upgradable firmware, no KVM switch, no built-in speakers, so quite a few areas cut to hit a low price point. However, we do get a height adjustable stand, good text clarity, and important considerations like graceful SDR-HDR switching and being able to use all of the gaming features together. I did want to touch on the flickering and pixel inversion results though. The Q27G3XMN does fail my pixel inversion test because you can see scanline artifacts in the Lagom stress test at the highest refresh rate. This is a faint result that's not as severe as you'd see from a Samsung Neo G8 at 240Hz for example, but it is visible, and in some patterns like the default Windows 11 wallpaper, I saw extremely faint scan lines that weren't visible on comparable IPS LCDs. I don't think this is a major concern while gaming, but there could be edge cases where scan lines are a problem. You can also almost entirely remove scan lines by running the display at 144Hz instead of the maximum 180Hz, which isn't too much of a downgrade, but ideally there would be no scan lines even at the highest refresh rate. As for flickering, the Q27G3XMN does not flicker in the traditional sense where the entire backlight pulses or blanks or otherwise does annoying behavior even while using adaptive sync. We're not talking about a Cooler Master GP27Q situation. However, with just 336 local dimming zones, in some HDR scenarios you will see minor flicker for small bright objects as they move across the screen and trigger the activation of different backlight zones. This is simply a downside of this type of dimming, and it'll depend how sensitive you are as to whether this annoys you while gaming. As it's a type of flicker, I gave it a borderline result. Overall, I come away reasonably impressed with the AOC Q27G3XMN. I've tested a few of these lower cost HDR LCDs lately, and this model is by far the best. It still has some issues and drawbacks. You're not getting the perfect HDR gaming display for just $280 US, but at this price point, it's genuinely impressive and easy to recommend. The best aspect of this AOC monitor is that someone is finally delivering actual HDR capable hardware when they advertise HDR in this price range. For far too long now, we've suffered through an atrocious display HDR 400 experience when purchasing a monitor below $400 US. With most decent true HDR products being restricted to over $800. The Q27G3XMN is a revolutionary product in that it ditches terrible edge-lit dimming for a proper 336 zone full array backlight, and yet it keeps the price in the same ballpark as other budget-friendly 1440p gaming monitors. The benefits of this are significant for HDR gaming. This AOC monitor is able to deliver much tighter dimming, a better contrast ratio in real-world content, richer blacks and shadows, and a high peak brightness that exceeds 1000 nits. And this is complemented by a 1440p panel at 180Hz, which is still really quite decent for today's games, and is another example of how HDR doesn't need a 4K resolution to be good. Of course, we're not seeing a flagship high-end experience from 336 zones. There can be issues with blooming and so on, but it absolutely destroys the competition at a similar price. Another reason why I've been impressed with this AOC monitor is it gets a lot of the little things right. Acer, for example, totally botched the firmware on their option with stupid restrictions, a slow interface, and frustrating switching between HDR and SDR. Cooler Master botched the tuning, making their monitor so dark it was hard to game on, along with very slow response times. None of these things are issues on the AOC model, and while not fully eliminated, this model does a sufficient job of minimizing flickering and scan lines. Motion performance is pretty acceptable too from a VA LCD, delivering the best tuning I've seen from a non-Samsung implementation. Dark level smearing isn't fully eliminated but not too problematic, and response time speed ends up similar to some other budget IPS LCDs. It's not a fast monitor by any stretch, but it does a good enough job that it's not a deal breaker for those that want an affordable true HDR monitor. At the end of the day, I would definitely recommend the Q27G3XMN to gamers after a great display for under $300 US. With this 1440p monitor occupying the $280 price point, I'd find it difficult to recommend something else that doesn't offer proper HDR. It's a real game changer. The glut of similar IPS LCDs around this price suddenly become much less attractive, and now it's over to other manufacturers to step up their game. It may not have a memorable name, in fact, Q27G3XMN is a shocker of a name, but I reckon this one will fly off shelves, so hopefully AOC can pump out a ton of them and expand availability to other countries. Anyway, that's it for this review. If you do want to support Monitors Unboxed and our independent monitor reviews and allow us to import these sorts of monitors from other countries like we did for this review, then please do consider supporting us via our Patreon or Float Plan accounts. Links are in the description below. If you want to know where your money goes, then it does go to buying products like this for reviews, and you also get a couple of cool bonuses and perks along the way, like access to our ICC profiles that we generate for our reviews. We've got our Discord chat, a great place to chat about monitors, get recommendations, just talk about the latest releases, monthly live streams, plenty of good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.